So we're here to solve the statue park puzzle with a tiny gap theme. It has probably an easier start than Monday's puzzle, but a harder finish. And the reason it has an easier start is one of the things this puzzle allows is to really just try to place four cell shapes into the grid and see that some of these options will quickly cancel. Like in the lower left, if we took these three cells, there's no fourth cell that we can take that's not going to bring a fifth cell with it. And so in the lower left, there's only one option that uses this corner that has a four cell choice for it. Similarly, this upper right, you'll see that if we came down this right column, we'd end up having to take 5 cells. So we always take these 3 and this fourth cell to form a shape. And so this I and this L are the early parts of the puzzle. We can mark in. Having marked those in, we now just get some cramping. And so cramping gets us the next few placements in the grid. We've got these 3 cells coming together. Can't take this one because it would get too large, so it takes these. We get an S comfortably placed. There's an interesting deduction on this top side. One way to see this is first this cell will always connect to this cell. This cell will always connect to this cell. Another thing to see is we actually can't isolate the single cell in the corner. So there's a starting T shape that's forced in that pattern, which means we've now placed 4 of the 10 shapes. Notice that this cell here is going to take this or take this, and whichever one it uses, it's going to form a T, and that T is going to sort of mark off these cells, and it means this cell isn't used. And so the last T is conceptually already in the grid. We can think about it coming from this. Not that avoiding a T shape is really the key logic right now, but it's just something to keep in mind. I think the next thing to really help us out is, again, to look at some of these corners that need to make shapes. And let's take this lower right corner. If it comes out and takes these cells, that is to say, if it dodges this, it's going to take 3, but it can't take a 4th without coming up and needing to get a 5th at the same time. And so just as the lower left corner and upper right corner have these constraints, the lower right, these 3 corners together all have the same idea. We've got to take 3 and get a 4th, and there's only a unique way to do that. So now all the L's are in the grid. We'll have to think through, I think, a counterfactual for the next step. And again, that comes from seeing there are 2 possible T's here. And so let's consider the T that's not taking this cell. And if this cell doesn't join to the one above, it's got to come down here and come down here. And there are 2 problems for it right now. First, it's isolating some white cells. And second, it would have to form a pentomino shape when it takes another cell here. And so one deduction you can say at this time is that this cell and this cell are part of the same shape. And in doing that, the T has to be the one that's above. We should now see that we've got 2 T's in the grid, 2 L's in the grid, and so whatever this shape is, it looks like it can be an O or an S, it can't be an I. We've got some limits on what the remaining shapes can be regardless. Let's sort of think about some limitations. First, if this cell isn't used by the group that's between these, then this is an I coming up here, but what is going to go into the space? If it's an O, it's cramped this tetromino, and if it's an S, it's cramped this tetromino. And so to be able to get a good shape over here, this cell is always used, and once you see that this cell is used, this cell between these is always used. That splits this out. That forces this to be an I. Putting that in, that forces this to be an O, so we get this shape and this shape in the grid. We've got an O and an S to place. This cell here can't form an S anymore, so it only can form an O. Notice by connectivity, we've got to shade this cell, and this is the last S that can go in the grid. And so we got through this puzzle by first looking for constrained clues that can't really grow to be a tetromino except in one way, and this I, this L, and this L are all forced through that. Then reaching out through the grid, we got the S's, the T's, other things placed centrally. We possibly could have looked at the O shape sooner. They're always limited in a tetromino puzzle, particularly a pattern like this with a lot of marked white cells. But hopefully you got a sense of how to work through this puzzle. We'll see you again soon.